part of the MSDI Research Seminar Committee, and I'll be emceeing today's session, welcoming Dr. Matthew Selinske. Welcome, Matthew. Well known to some of us. Hopefully a wider group of you are meeting him for the first time to hear about his cool work as well. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. I understand the area I was in might have been called Bulukabek, or land of grass and trees, and also pleased to say the area has been renamed Rocky Place, or Marybeck, as a council area too, which is kind of neat. And it's a feeling of interest and grief and respect that they have so much to share with us about conservation and behaviour in their own ways of this land, and we've lost so much of that knowledge as well. And I hope you're all reflecting about where you're dialing from and that knowledge that's still here, and also what we've lost as well. Now, Matthew is known to many of us at MSDI, and particularly Behaviour Works, through his work in the ICON group at RMIT, which is an interdisciplinary group looking at conservation and nature. There's a community of practice that's formed around behaviour and conservation, around the joint appointment between that RMIT group and Behaviour Works and MSDI, with DELP, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, and the Arthur Riley Institute. If people would like information about that, please feel free to reach out to myself in the first instance, but a number of the people you just heard talking can also tell you about that. And there is a meeting tomorrow too, if anyone's interested in joining it, but it's focused around conservation and behaviour, so that's the entry point anyway. Matthew has quite a interesting, varied and prestigious history he brings to it. I won't repeat everything on the flyer, but I'd like to acknowledge that he's the president of the Society of the Conservation Biology Social Science Working Group. So he's been working at that intersection of the social and environmental sciences for a long time, and he's also got some impressive practical experience working in restoration projects in the US and Africa before he started his research career as well. So like many of us here, he brings a number of different lenses to the challenges and interests of his work, and brings it together in interesting ways. I think personally his work is particularly interesting because I see behaviour change in the space of conservation and biodiversity as being very much at the hard end of behaviour change. It's complex. There's a whole bunch of biophysical, scientific, geographic, many populations, many behaviours involved, issues. So you know, it's where you really get into the weeds with behaviour change, and inevitably it means that Matthew has thought and worked deeply looking at how does behaviour change scale up into bigger systems, and the interactions between behaviour, organisations, policies, and also the biophysical and geographical context as well. And so, yeah, I think you'll appreciate, those of you who haven't heard his work before, his interdisciplinary, pragmatic and impact-focused approach to these things, which really does a great job, I think, of linking theory and practice in his work. But enough from me. You've come to hear from Matthew himself. So Matthew, if I've missed anything you really wanted to emphasise at the beginning of that in terms of your background, please feel free to add to it. But otherwise, over to you. Once Matthew has talked for, I'm sure, less than 40 minutes, hopefully closer to 30, Matthew, we'll have time for questions. If you'd like to add questions or comments in the message box via the comments in the app, feel free to, and I'll do a level of what do you call it, emceeing the discussion afterwards as well, based on what's there. But over to you, Matthew.
Thanks, Evan, and yeah, really appreciate that, and I also appreciate your acknowledgement of country, and I need to work at mine, but it was impressive, and I probably won't go into my acknowledgement of country, but I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands of on which each of you are residing and working, and Stefan lives fairly close to me, and I'm just on the border of Marybeck. So, and as Stefan mentioned, and I first off, I want to say that for some of you, you were involved in some of the work that I'll be presenting today. So my apologies if some of this is repetitive, especially for Liam, who helped externally review my PhD thesis. So yeah, I apologize, especially to him. But some of this might be interesting, and yeah, I just think that today, hopefully, Stefan's asked me talk a little bit about the interdisciplinary projects I'm involved in, and then have a little more lengthy discussion about some of the behavioral prioritization work I've done with DELP. And so it's my hope that, one, this is an interesting presentation, but also demonstrates some interesting methods that you could potentially apply in other contexts that you're working with. And also just, I kind of think it demonstrates the challenge of biodiversity and biodiversity behavior change, and that we desperately need engagement from behavioral scientists and social scientists like yourselves. So as Stefan mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at RMIT. I'm with the ICON Science Group, and we're a interdisciplinary conservation science lab. And we're made up of social scientists, behavioral scientists, different types of ecologists, biologists, urban planners, and even some ex-physicists. And so in my work, I apply tools from social sciences, mainly behavioral sciences, to biodiversity conservation issues. And this research is mostly co-developed in partnerships with government and NGOs, and even some businesses, to support its relevancy, the research's relevancy to conservation science and practice, conservation policy and practice, excuse me. And so, just to start things off with, and I don't think this is anything new for most of you, but we not only face a climate crisis as a society, but we also face a biodiversity crisis. And we're likely entering an era that will be defined as the sixth mass extinction. A recent IPBES report, and IPBES is I don't know if you've heard of it, I'm sure you have, but it's the Intergovernmental Panel of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. It's basically the biodiversity conservation equivalent to the IPCC. And their report states that up to 1 million species face extinction today. And nowhere is that more apparent and acutely felt than in Australia, which has the highest extinction rate in the world. And this is going to continue to happen without appropriate funding and policies from the government. Now, we, of course, depend on biodiversity as a society from ecosystem services. Our economy depends on biodiversity. And it's clear from decades of work that our personal well-being depends on engagement in nature. And some of that work has come from this group here. So really to thwart the worst impacts of climate change, to save those many species from extinction, and really support the natural processes that we depend on as a society. This IPBES goes further. This 2019 IPBES report calls for transformative change across economic, social, political, and technological factors. And that transformative change really requires both systems change and individual change. And I'm sure I don't have to make this point to you all, and you understand the importance of individual change and how that contributes to collective and systems change. But there's been a lot of quite critical attention on individual behavior change as of late. And some of that is certainly, I think, valid, especially when that individual change is promoted cynically by the very large organizations that are actually major contributors to global GHGs and to habitat loss. But, the transformative change also requires, that social support for this policy and economic and technological changes that are ultimately critical to a sustainable transition. And to address problems, really challenging problems like beef production and consumption, something that has a direct impact on both biodiversity and a contribution to GHGs. You think about feasibility issues, it might be feasible for the government to subsidize or regulate a more biodiversity-friendly production of beef, but it's certainly impractical in a society like ours and other places for the government to strictly regulate beef consumption, something that we need to reduce beef consumption, and we need to do that through less coercive consumption-based interventions. So I think individual change has a real place in transformative change. And certainly willing to talk about that more in the Q&A. I think this figure by Amel et al. Really illustrates this well in terms of thinking about spheres of influence and moving out across those spheres of influence. And as you do that, the larger impact you have on those sustainability issues that you're involved in. And of course, we can do a lot with our own private and personal spheres of influence in terms of making these decisions, but those might have smaller impact. And as we engage others, we support others to make better sustainability decisions, or we help organize and vote and protest. And if we're leaders or embedded within an organization and help change those processes and procedures that are more sustainable, we can have, key individuals can have a tremendous impact, I think, on the sustainability of society and biodiversity more specifically. So just briefly in talking about some of the interdisciplinary projects I'm involved in right now, and I think in line with investigating this organizational level change, one of the projects I'm working with Sarah Beckesian, who's the leader of Icon Science, Georgia Gerard, who's at University of Melbourne, and Fiona Hoag Goldberg, is we're examining private sector engagement in biodiversity. Now, this is just a small part of a larger project that's working with multiple different researchers and ecologists to envision and develop biodiversity net gain mechanisms and policies that will support on-site biodiversity gains across sectors. And whoever has their microphone on, if you could please turn off, that'd be great. It's just slightly distracting. So basically what this project is trying to do is develop mechanisms and policies that is basically the opposite of destroying biodiversity and offsetting it elsewhere, where we would try to support biodiversity gains on site across multiple different types of business sectors. And as part of this project, I've been interviewing people in business that are integrating biodiversity into their decision making. So we're documenting their different approaches and models of integrating biodiversity. And I'm listening to their perspectives on what motivates them and what drives their organization to engage in this work, and some of the conflicts between their personal motivations and the drivers within that organization. What are some of the barriers and enablers to accomplishing their goals in relation to biodiversity? Even discussed how they measure biodiversity and account for biodiversity change. And then their thoughts on how we can transform the private sector to align with a more net positive biodiversity future. And I really think that for transformation to happen in society, businesses are going to have to change as well. That seems obvious. The economy is going to change, and certain businesses could catalyze or could be a catalyst in their sector and beyond, and specifically influencing their consumers and suppliers. And even some of the businesses I've interviewed had direct attention on influencing the government to support biodiversity conservation policies and some of their practices that they were doing within that business. And so, this interest in larger scale change, but still tied to that individual change, has led to other projects. And this one you're probably familiar with, which is we're informing and evaluating Zoos Victoria Wildlife Friendly Coffee campaign that just recently launched last week. And as part of this project, we're not just focusing on the consumers, but my colleagues Dale Wright and Pia Lentini and others are including Yoshi Kashima, who you might know at University of Melbourne, who's a cultural psychologist, people from Cornell and Smithsonian. We're taking a supply chain approach, engaging other leverage points, including producers and suppliers, to support the production of coffee that has biodiversity benefits. I've also been working on a couple of projects with my colleagues Nairi Raby and Dale Wright again, and we're examining biodiversity footprints of the city of Melbourne and the water utility company Yarra Valley Water. Now, Yarra Valley Water is all in and really wants to go a step further by quantifying their biodiversity footprint through their supply chain and sites of operation, and also somehow documenting the organizational influence they have on their suppliers and consumers, potentially other organizations within the Melbourne area and Victoria. And they're also seeking pathways that, how to become nature positive, or I guess in other words, to be an organization that have a net positive impact on biodiversity. And they're really kind of on the forefront of things. And I think things are this nature positive type, this wording is really becoming prevalent in business sectors and in governments. And so I'm really interested in investigating this kind of change that occurs in an organization and goes, what kind of change it goes through to set goals of becoming nature positive, and something that I'm studying as part of this project. And this is hopes of developing, some sort of evidence or understanding to support other organizations and businesses going through similar changes now and in the future. Okay, so with that, this is I basically have engaged in about 3 prioritization studies. And some of this was done during my PhD, which I finished about 3 years ago. And so a number of you probably are very familiar with the identifying, prioritizing human behaviors that benefit biodiversity work that we did with DELP. Probably less so with the interventions to reduce beef consumption, thinking about what kind of interventions have the greatest efficacy and feasibility to be implemented to change beef consumption. And then Some of you also might be familiar with some of the thinking about projecting biodiversity benefits and cost effectiveness of conservation behavior change programs, some work that just was published last year. So I'm going to go through these, the first project and the second project. And if you're interested in talking about beef consumption, I'm always passionate to chat about this and the implications of behavior change in this realm. And so we can talk about that in the Q&A or at another time that's convenient. So just to give you some background on how I kind of came to considering prioritization for biodiversity behaviors, just as a kind of a step back. Prior to my research, as Stefan mentioned, I was working in the conservation field for about a decade, working in private area management and primate conservation in West Africa, working with landowners in the Midwest on restoration projects. And then in my PhD and just slightly, I guess, during my master's and my PhD, and continuing, I'm still working in private land conservation. And I've, thinking about what motivates individuals to participate in private land conservation and how do we increase the effectiveness of private land conservation programs by considering those social and behavioral dimensions, and work that I drew on social psychology and economics frameworks for. But it always struck me as well, what about those individuals, like say within Melbourne or other larger cities, or just people that don't own a bush block, don't have that direct engagement? And I guess the context I had worked in prior, these individuals had really interesting and direct relationships with nature and direct relationships with impacts on nature. And so what about those that don't? What behaviors could we be targeting of those individuals, some maybe everyday individuals or that have the biggest impact on biodiversity? And can we think about behavior change more systematically and prioritize those behaviors that have significant impacts? And around the time, I think in the middle of my PhD, this paper came out by Wines and Nicholas, and I'm sure you've seen this before. It's a nice convenient figure on personal choices to reduce your contribution to climate change, and they categorize these actions with high impact, moderate impact, and low impact. And I thought that was a really nice way to summarize this type of prioritization. And I was wondering if there was something else out there, like has the conservation field engaged in this space yet? Is there something online where I could pull some recommendations for how to save nature, how to promote biodiversity? So I went online and I found this, one of the first websites that popped up, and 11 ways to save Mother Earth. And you can still go to this website now and see the same exact list. And the first thing that it mentions is say hello to a stranger. And I thought, well, yeah, I'm all about engagement and community and talking and getting strangers' perspectives on things. But I just found it to be a longbow to say that by engaging a stranger, you're going to somehow benefit Mother Earth and biodiversity more specifically. So that was 5 years ago, and there are better resources now out there, and some of the resources out there now we contributed to. But obviously at the time I was not satisfied with this list. And some of you might be aware of this, but in prioritization, in conservation and conservation planning specifically, we prioritize a lot, and where to invest money, what species to protect, what type of management actions are most cost effective. We even try to prioritize the questions of importance for conservation. And so it just seemed like a logical extension that we would prioritize conservation behaviors. And of course, I was not the first person to think of this. I guess I was familiar with Wesley Schultz's work, but I maybe wasn't familiar with his promotion of prioritization. And of course, before that, with community-based social marketing, there's been plenty of prioritization of behaviors, but nobody had necessarily done it within the conservation space as of that time. And so Wesley Schultz, in that a really good essay, Conservation Means Behavior, suggests that a way to prioritize conservation behaviors is by the impact on biodiversity. And so what has the greatest effect on biodiversity, and then determine the plasticity of those behaviors. And plasticity, essentially the changeability or likelihood of change. And so in this article, we argue that while there was this growing interest in conservation from behavioral sciences and psychology, just the amount and breadth of this research wasn't commensurate to the challenges that we face in conservation. And so So we thought that a behavioral prioritization could potentially help us develop a biodiversity behavior research agenda, and that we would be able to engage behavioral scientists and psychologists and work with them to design studies to reduce these behaviors' impacts on biodiversity. We also felt that a list could benefit individuals that were concerned about their impact. And wanted to engage and potentially had some feelings of a lack of self-efficacy to do so. And then again, it would have been a really good tool to direct policymakers with as well. Before I go on any further, I just want to point out that we were not the first nor the last to call for more engagement from behavioral sciences and psychology into conservation science. And there's some really great works out there, and it spans multiple decades of people kind of hand waving and say, hey, there's a whole space out here that's of interest, potentially of interest for behavioral sciences, and it's a really great space to engage, and actually a really critical space to engage as well, given the biodiversity crisis that we face. So, but thinking about a prioritization of biodiversity behaviors, how would we actually measure the impact or behavior's impact on biodiversity? And when you think about it, the behavioral sciences and environmental psychology have long engaged with other environmental problems such as energy use and water use to an extent. I've proposed, or I think that these potential behavior changes in those contexts tend to be easier to quantify. A lot of these studies are often done at the household level, where maybe there's a bit easier to measure. They're harder. They're easier to quantify than biodiversity, and I think that's estimating the exact effects of specific behaviors on biodiversity is just inherently difficult, as Stefan said. And these threats to biodiversity are diverse. They're contextual. Biodiversity itself is challenging to quantify, and using that appropriate measure of biodiversity is really difficult to decide on. And people have arguments within conservation over what measurement to use. Some of the behaviors, some of the impacts on biodiversity might have obscure links to those driving behaviors. And also, if we're implementing a behavior change program, the time lag for impact on biodiversity might be quite long. It's a lot of challenges. But I guess to start exploring this space, and the impacts that behaviors have in Australia and Victoria more specifically, we did some threat analyses, and we used input-output analysis integrated with biodiversity data to look at the industries and the sectors that have the biggest impact on biodiversity in Australia. And that was done with Manfred Lenzen's lab up at Environmental Accounting Lab at University of Sydney. A great thing about input-output analyses is that you're able to trace commodity flows and the embodied impact that has on biodiversity across different sectors and different products and different countries. The problem is that it's generally a coarse tool and looks at sectors at a fairly coarse level. But we were able to determine that through this input-output analysis that housing development in Australia is the biggest impact of any industry. Commercial development has a very large impact. Fishing, agriculture, specifically beef and lamb, and they have significant impacts on biodiversity. And I'm not going to take you through the details of that because it can be quite boring. We also did a threat analysis using the EPC. The EPBC listed species act. And so looking at the threats of those EPBC listed species. Sorry, there's too many IPCCs and IPBIS and other things. So, and we're looking at the threats that were driving Victorian species that were listed on the EPBC listed list. So, and we found, invasive species were large drivers of biodiversity loss, logging, agriculture again. And we systematically categorized those across Victorian species to come up with a threat list. And so we had understanding of the greatest threats to biodiversity, and that allowed us to potentially think of, okay, what behaviors are associated with those industries or with those different threats that that Victorian biodiversity is facing. But then also, what about those behaviors that are more social in nature, that you engage individuals with, and or activism or voting? Surely they have important impacts as well. And so I think that's something that really kind of struck me as something that's missing, or an element that's missing from these threat analyses. And so at the same time, we started working with DELP, and I misspelled DELP. DELP biodiversity, the DELP Biodiversity 2037 plan, and their strategy. There was a major focus on social dimensions of nature, and of course, you guys are very familiar with that, with the Victorian valuing nature segment of that, and the importance of connecting to nature and acting for nature as part of that Biodiversity 2037 plan. So there was interest in developing a list of behaviors that DELP could potentially support. And so with DELP, we organized a workshop, and we invited a number of different individuals representing various groups within Melbourne and Victoria, and a diverse group of experts, practitioners, ecologists, social scientists, behavioral scientists. And with the help of those threat analyses, that kind of helped inform the discussion around these different behaviors that we could associate with impacts on biodiversity. We also kind of reviewed the latest literature in terms of the social impacts on biodiversity, and how we could think about social behaviors a little bit more. And we used to come up with a list of behaviors. We used the nominal group technique, and I believe Liam has used that actually in his PhD as well, to come up with a list of behaviors for zoos to focus on. But we were able to come up with a list of 27 behaviors after some discussion and combining different categories of behaviors. And we came up with a broad list. We didn't want, understandably, when you're trying to prioritize behaviors, you should come up with the most, I guess, indivisible behavior. So not just seafood consumption, but seafood consumption at home or in a restaurant. It really depends on where you're trying to change. But for this process, as a first step, we wanted to come up with a more broader list and broader categories of behaviors. And after that workshop, we had a survey that went out to all the participants, and we asked them to rate the impact that behavior of that list of 27 behaviors, one of those behaviors, would have on biodiversity across all 27 of those behaviors. And so also to think about the plasticity of the behavior and consider the barriers and the challenges of engaging in that behavior, and rate that as well. And so, and following that survey, we were able to come up with a prioritization matrix that I'll walk you through in just a second. But we're also able to determine the prevalence of the behavior through published research. And it's really following a standard approach advocated by Mackenzie Moore in community-based marketing, and I'm sure others. And so this great work by Sarah Kneebone and Liam and Kelly Fielding, the impact, we were able to think about the behaviors and place them on this impact likelihood matrix. And Sarah did this for water, of course, water behaviors. And so on the x-axis, you have behavioral plasticity, or the likelihood of engagement, and biodiversity impact is on that x-axis, the y-axis, excuse me. And you can categorize these behaviors based on in these different quadrants. So whether they're easy and effective, easy but ineffective, hard and ineffective, and hard but effective. And so thinking about some of these easy, kind of low-hanging fruit might be from the easy but ineffective category. Behaviors that you want to invest time in and money in, that easy and effective category, that upper right-hand quadrant. Hard but effective behaviors might be behaviors that are challenging to change, but they're worth the investment because they might have a quite large impact on biodiversity. And there might be some behaviors that you'd want to avoid that would fall across that lower left-hand quadrant. And of course, I should say that behavior change is rarely easy. So this is, I think, all relative. So here on this work, you can see the average scores of the behavioral plasticity across the x-axis, and the average scores from those experts taking that survey for impact on the y-axis of the prioritization matrix. And I think it's a really good list of 27 behaviors, and I think that there's some interesting things that came out of this exercise. A couple of points to highlight here are the advocacy behaviors were kind of viewed by these individuals taking the survey, the experts, that they're considered high impact, but were hard to get people to engage with. And I think that makes sense to me. The social behaviors, like talking to friends about conservation issues, discussing nature stories, or supporting others' decisions to engage in conservation behaviors, were seen as easy to take part, but potentially had lower impact. And I think probably, if you think about this, that maybe the uncertainty threw off some of the experts on this, and that there's uncertainty around these behaviors, so therefore maybe the impact is lower, or the certainty of impact is lower. But these private sphere behaviors were seen as high impact and high plasticity. And in this prioritization matrix, we have reduced beef and lamb consumption, responsible cat ownership, choosing MSC certified products, so Marine Stewardship Council seafood products, wildlife gardening, responsible dog ownership, a number of important behaviors for an individual to take part in. When furthering that prioritization, we incorporated the current behavioral prevalence that I mentioned before. So based on previously published research or polling data, and also data that was available from the Victorians Valuing Nature survey done by Behavior Works. This was incorporated into analysis, which is basically a prioritization formula from community-based social marketing. And basically what this does is, if a behavior is very high and prevalent in society, it may not need to be focused on, and as such, its importance will rank. And so here's that list of 10 behaviors, and includes actually a lot of personal, again, private sphere behaviors and some advocacy behaviors as a result of that prevalence formula, or the prevalence inclusion, the prevalence data. But I think, thinking about prevalence and the importance of it in terms of ranking behaviors, I don't think it really mattered in this regard, but in other instances, using that prioritization formula might discount certain behaviors that are, let's say, at 30% or 40%, maybe behaviors that are on the cusp of a social tipping point. So I think in the article we do a good job of potentially stating the negatives of using that prevalence data. I think obviously there's more work to be done in this space in terms of prioritization, surveying specific segments of society to determine their perceptions of actually engaging that prioritized behavior, or potentially setting up experiments or interventions to determine the plasticity of a behavior. Thinking about further dividing the behaviors into indivisible units to test as well. I also think the key message here is that human behavior drives multiple threats to biodiversity, and obviously multiple behaviors are required to change those threats. And we should be providing opportunities to engage in these type of behaviors all the time. When the opportunity arises, or the individual wants to engage, that opportunity should be there. And also thinking about different types of engagement. Yeah, it's fine to ask people to reduce their beef consumption, or get them to contain their cat, but also, I think it's really important to prioritize behaviors that such as wildlife gardening, that might create a deeper engagement with nature, or potentially advocacy that can contribute to an identity that supports more engagement in advocacy issues. So as we mentioned, as I mentioned,
9 to 8 minutes warning, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Stefan. I've certainly taken my time. Okay, worked closely with DELP on this, as I mentioned, they came up with their own 5 behaviors that they wanted to promote on behalf of the Victorian government, and produced a brief on that. So happy to share that around if you're interested. As I mentioned before, they were also interested in a structured decision-making tool for making decisions about environmental engagement and behavior change interventions, that projecting behaviors that impact biodiversity and behavior change interventions. They believed that if they could better demonstrate the cost effectiveness and benefits of behavioral interventions and compare against other conservation management actions, they could potentially enable greater resourcing from the state government and for conservation behavior change. And so what I saw this as an opportunity to also think about that impact of behavior as well. And so thinking about direct and indirect behaviors. And just as a refresher, those direct behaviors are seen as proximally more immediately linked to conservation impacts. So as I described as private land conservation, or someone removing garbage from the beach has a direct impact on the marine life in that area. And these indirect behaviors, on the other hand, are behaviors that influence direct behaviors through more immediate steps, such as influencing others to adopt pro-conservation behaviors. And so I'll try not to go too quickly through this, but I will get done in about 9 minutes. And so this research we used, and so this projection research, we used 2 types of conservation behavior change programs, so cat containment and wildlife gardening, to measure the technical potential of conservation behavior change interventions. So we chose these 2 different programs because there was existing information on the cost and intervention efficacy in terms of uptake by communities. And we identified areas, an area in Cranbourne where these programs were potentially going to be implemented. And both wildlife gardening and cat containment, as you probably noticed from the previous work, were prioritized behaviors. And so to measure the benefits of these programs to biodiversity, we adapted a decision support tool used by the Victorian government to assess cost effectiveness of conservation actions for a species or multiple species. And so this decision support tool uses expert elicitation to determine the benefits and costs of conservation projects to maximize conservation gains over 50 years. Now that timeline of 50 years, really bothered me initially, but it allows for time lags in ecological and social processes, but also the potential impact of climate change. And so we asked, given a behavior change program scenario, so we provided scenarios, what will the probability or the likelihood that a species will be present in 50 years' time? And then we compared that against a scenario in which there was no behavior change program. And this is how we calculated that benefit to biodiversity. And so for those of you who are dubious potentially about expert elicitation, there's a lot of great work out there by Victoria Hemming and Mark Bergman, who are formerly at University of Melbourne, on how to get the best out of experts. And so to gain a better understanding of these impacts on behavior, on the behaviors would have on a selected species or multiple species in this context, we employed a modified Delphi procedure. And that's the IDEA protocol. That's a repeated, transparent way to get information or get experts to give estimates. And so we ran an interdisciplinary workshop with ecologists, community engagement specialists, and people that were familiar with the program and context, a diverse group of experts. And Mark Bergen always says that if you know to ask the question, then you have place in the expert elicitation. And we recruited 9 experts in total, and nine is considered an optimal number in the expert elicitation literature. So we came up with a number of plausible scenarios and assumptions of cat containment and wildlife gardening programs. We discussed those assumptions and scenarios and agreed with the experts they are plausible. And I'm not going to go into detail because obviously of time, but we presented 11 different scenarios to these experts. And these scenarios varied in levels of uptake of behaviors within the community. So we varied the types of behaviors examined as well, the indirect versus direct. And in most scenarios, we isolated the 2 programs, so cat containment from wildlife gardening, to get an understanding of the impact or I guess potential of just one program. In a few scenarios, we also combined the programs to see the collective impact of these programs on selected species. And so in this IDEA protocol, the experts give their own 3-point estimate, meaning they give a best estimate of persistence of a species given a scenario, in addition to a high and low estimate of persistence. And that provides us with a measure of uncertainty for each expert. Something that, again, thinking about that uncertainty is so important with biodiversity behaviors. We aggregated these estimates for across the participants, and we fed back the information to the participants at this workshop. And this was followed by a discussion, and then we aggregated the 3 estimates and gave them an opportunity to revise. And those estimates, and then aggregated them again. Excuse me. So in this analysis, we needed some proxies for biodiversity, or at least a species that was of concern, and a way to measure biodiversity benefit from conservation behaviors. So we used the superb fairy wren and the southern brown bandicoot. Southern brown bandicoot is, of course, a threatened species in Victoria. And they were selected because they're charismatic animals and something you could build a program around to market it. But they also represent clades of species that may respond in similar ways, and also are fairly tolerant of human activity and resilient to temperature fluctuations, which will be important with coming climate change. Now, in the context in Cranbourne, there are existing populations of both of these species, and new developments potentially threaten to geographically isolate these two species and introduce new threats, such as free roaming cats. Okay. So let me quickly walk you through the two programs, their targeted behaviors and the hypothesized impact chains. So for cat containment, we based our hypothetical programs on previous interventions and research in Victoria and South Australia. For instance, with cat containment program, we included the direct behavior of containing a cat at all times, or in one scenario, only during the nighttime. And for both behaviors, would reduce cat density in the landscape, which reduces predation pressure on southern brown bandicoot and superb fairy wren, increasing the probability of species persistence. The indirect behavior in this case is participating in a citizen science cat tracker program with a GPS unit allows cat owners to track and view and report their cat movements. And the idea is that some cat owners will become more concerned about the safety of their cat when they observe the distances the cat's traveled, leading to more containment of cats and indirectly influencing species persistence, or the likelihood that those species will be found in those locations in the future. So unlike the cat containment program, where the link between behavior and biodiversity impact is fairly straightforward, wildlife gardening is more complex with a number of specific behaviors associated with this type of behavior change program. So not only are people planting native plants suitable for these species, providing water, they're also reducing pesticide use. And in the context we examined, they'll be installing bandicoot passageways that increase backyard connectivity for southern brown bandicoots. And this leads to the outcomes of increased habitat and movement within the landscape and reduced pressure, reduced threat of pesticides, resulting in increased species persistence. Now, the indirect behaviors included installing wildlife gardening signs that may influence others to participate both formally and informally in the program. And this includes volunteering with the program, providing gardening expertise to others to help get started with the wildlife garden, and participating in a citizen science research, which may help inform the management of the selected species. And these outcomes affect the indirect outcomes, and indirect behaviors influence direct behaviors and indirectly influence species persistence. So in 1 minute, I'm going to go through these results, and I'm not going to go through these specific scenarios. Just remember the combined estimates of benefit from our experts after the second round of elicitation, and the mean benefit of actions are based on expert estimates of probability of persistence compared with the counterfactual, which is that no action scenario that's been circled here. So cat containment has a strong impact on species persistence, so the scenarios 2 through 4, and that makes sense. But as you would expect, nighttime cat containment scenario 2 benefits bandicoots, which are nocturnal and crepuscular, meaning that they're only active dusk, night, and dawn, has less impact on superb fairy wrens, which is a diurnal species, a daytime species. Persistence of species increases with the increased uptake of wildlife gardening, scenarios 5 through 8, and that makes sense. And here's I guess, one of the crux of the presentation is that inclusion of indirect behaviors increased estimated benefits to species. And remember, the indirect behaviors were those related to influencing others to participate in wildlife gardening, engaging in citizen science, and for the cat tracker program, participating in the cat tracker initiative, but also increased the uncertainty of those benefits. And that's what I've circled there. And I'll actually just skip ahead. There's not a lot of surprising results here. Of course, the two programs that were combined had the benefits for both species. And of course, when we added real cost data for the programs, the combined two programs had the greatest cost efficiencies, mainly as a result of combining administrative costs. So I just think that in this work, we've demonstrated some of the ways to start thinking more strategically about conservation behavior change and the benefits to biodiversity and cost effectiveness of interventions. These methods were fairly easy to use to prioritize behaviors and demonstrate costs and benefits of program. And I think these methods are especially useful when there's not much known about a problem. Some guidance is needed. And potentially when there's resources needed to be deployed quickly, if there's a issue that arises as kind of in a short time frame, or as often happens when governments and other organizations have money that needs to be spent right away. So it gives you a great way to prioritize actions. And I think with one last point I'd like to say is that biodiversity loss is a critical issue. It's critical that we get more social and behavioral scientists engaged in conservation research. And I think that conservation likely offers a rich study area for understanding social and behavioral processes. So yeah, and just wanted to plug
Matthew.
Path, and I really appreciate you listening, and of course to my collaborators. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Matthew. Feel free to show your reactions and stuff, guys. So Matthew, thank you for obviously a lot of really great details and examples and projects, whirlwind tour of how behavioral science and decision science can really help with these things. Lots of great papers and so on to follow up on there. I assume you can share us a copy of your slides or at least your references later, Matt, for people to follow up on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great.
Am I still sharing my?
You are. Yep. Yeah. So you could
okay.
close that. I mean, it's possible someone will want to discuss the slide, I guess, but you can bring it up again. Now, I'm happy to start with a question, but it looks like Rob might have a question. So let's start with Rob. Go, Rob.
Oh, thanks, Stefan. I didn't want to cut you off, but now that I got the mic, I'm happy to go ahead. Thanks, Matthew, for a great presentation. My question is about the relationship between behavior and transformation. You started the presentation talking about transformation and the need to transform, basically. So how do you see that relationship? And in particular, do you consider all behaviors to be transformative potentially, or are some behaviors more transformative than others? Maybe it's the indirect behaviors that are more transformative because they target sort of some of the structures. I think that's how it looked like, organizational structures and so on. And I wonder if it would actually be helpful if you have that matrix, if you could actually add an X to that matrix, where you would also classify behaviors as being perhaps more incremental versus transformative, and then you would target the behaviors that are most impactful, most easy, and most transformative, or have the most transformative potential. Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting. And how do you quantify, or how do you determine, or how would you rate what is more transformative than the other? I mean, obviously, yeah, there's going to be social engagement, where there's research that demonstrates that if we can get 4% of the population out on the streets and sustained nonviolent protests, we can shape the way our society potentially could, combat climate change. It's been seen to support civil rights, at least. So there's some of that work that, I think that collective action, specifically around protesting and some of those more social behaviors, would support that evidence. And I guess there are some behaviors that are transformative and those that are not. And I guess some behaviors that might be transformative in an individual sense, right? Thinking about wildlife gardening, is wildlife gardening transformative? And I guess collectively over time that it could be, and it would be transformational for an individual to engage with, and that transformation could scale up to a neighborhood level, where we've seen work, and I'm sure you're familiar with that work, where individuals within a community start aligning their gardening practices or their landscaping practices together, and then scaling up to serious benefits to society. So yeah, I think it's a good question. I think that transformational axis would be quite interesting to play around with as well. What are your thoughts?
Maybe to elaborate on that, Matt, there's a paper by Chad Baum and others, Sustainability Policy as if People Mattered, where they don't quite say it as directly as I'm going to ask you, but they imply essentially that if we focus on behavior change on easy but effective behaviors, maybe we're more driving towards incremental change, and that maybe we should be focusing on hard but effective behaviors because the underlying systems have to change to reach them. I'm just interested in what you think about that proposition, and thinking specifically about some of your examples, would you agree that there's that dynamic exists between the two of them? I think that's one way you could sort of zoom in a little bit on Rob's question.
Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. And there is a dynamism there. And I think, I'm writing a Decker right now on interventions and transformative change and thinking about how they can play a part. And it seems to me that there are certain decisions that governments are going to be able to make that don't need support from the public, that they'll be done and it'll be easy transformation, or maybe not an easy transformation, but they'll be able to implement that. But there's going to be other things that need societal support, and so those behaviors that support those changes, and it might be a technological change, or it might be an economic change, like in terms of cost structures of fuel or whatever it is. Does that make sense? It's challenging, and I think, I
think your comments highlight that there's temporal dimensions, there's scale dimensions,
right?
There's who's doing what dimensions, and that
Yeah.
all could inform it, couldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
But anyway,
really,
not to. Sorry, go on. Yeah.
I'm just really interested in the idea of feasibility, and there'll be, that these interventions there'll be institutional feasibility, there'll be social feasibility, political feasibility, economic feasibility, and understanding, I guess, that science of feasibility is really key here.
We've had a question from Joe Sanson for a little while. Do you want to ask Joe?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matthew, for this. It's really fascinating. I work at Climate Work Centre. I see a few of my colleagues here in the Land Use Futures program. And I think there's a lot of things which you're talking about here, which I think are very relevant to our work. One of the things I was wanting to follow up on is around this question of diets, because we've been working with our partners at Deakin to be really modeling the impacts of changes in diets and looking at a number of different changes. And I think within that, we've got a number of different options about how we do that. So I'd be sort of interested in potentially following up around, some of the different implications of how we model different diets and how that is sort of used for informing sort of decision-making, both sort of more at that policy level, but also at that behavior change, individual level. But I'd say one of the really challenging things we find around this is the issue of exports. When you model these changes, the impacts are really not that large because the majority of agricultural produce in Australia is exported. And, so that's something which we're also including in the model, but it actually creates some real sort of dilemmas in terms of that messaging. You include that and it says, well, somebody could easily take away the message, well, why bother changing my diet when so much of this stuff is exported, which of course is a highly political issue. But at the same time, it's so important that we put that on the table. And I think one of the things which we're thinking a bit about is how sort of awareness of issues related to, say, the impacts of, beef and sheep, and, how that sort of that connection between people's own personal choices and that understanding about what that means in terms of the broader economy and those sort of larger policy decisions. So it's a bit of a, not a particularly clear question here, but interested in your thoughts about.
Yeah, it's something we flag in that paper that I co-authored with Sarah and others, and we flagged that while we could potentially reduce beef consumption within Victoria or Australia, a lot of that is exported overseas, and so therefore there's some constraints to how effective that would be, and so that's why that second paper that I wrote on, or that we did on beef consumption, and we also use expert elicitation there. That was focused on U.S. because the U.S. is the place that we would definitely need to focus reducing beef consumption, and I think in certain South American countries that have the highest per capita beef consumption rate in the world. And so, that's a real challenge, right? The Australia's putting itself up to be a huge exporter of food to feed the 8 billion people that we'll have soon and the 9 billion people in the future, right? But I don't think there's an easy access. What did you write, Stefan? I don't think there's a real easy answer there. But
I was just reflecting that the same tension exists when we're talking about things like greenhouse gas emissions. You can contrast Australia's domestic greenhouse emission footprint with the global one too, and it does get very political. But I don't know, I suppose it goes to where your domain of change that you're trying to affect is, and even while change in one space might be relatively small to others, it all adds up, particularly when you're talking about things like greenhouse, maybe more so than biodiversity, though I'm sure there's a net aggregate effect of biodiversity actions as well. Yeah.
I think especially with beef, like up in the Brigalow Belt, and the beef consumption or beef production is tied so closely to deforestation that there's other ways to potentially tackle that and potentially reduce its impacts within Australia. But yeah, but less so with I suppose with GHG emissions. Yeah.
I suppose what might be interesting too would be to explore if there's behavioural spillover in terms of changes in diet and policy support for banning exports or changing what is exported as well. There might be some pathways of change that relate to domestic change first, leading towards support for changing business models and export. Yeah. We have a question from Liam.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Thanks. Great presentation. Good to see what else you're working on post PhD. My question's about the word biodiversity and partly in terms of what it means behaviourally, because I think a lot of people are very happy to donate or vote to save a koala or potentially a southern brown bandicoot or whatever it may be, but the word biodiversity in some ways feels like it does a bit of it's there are so many behaviors attached to it that in some ways your task is limitless, I guess. And so perhaps it's a two-pronged question. One is about how did you grapple with that? I know you sort of talked about categories, but I think that's an ongoing issue. But the second thing is when we think about interventions and trying to get change, is it doing us more harm than good talking about biodiversity rather than about individual species?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the way I think for conservationists, it's good to talk about biodiversity, but I think for the general public and maybe even for engaging behavioral scientists and others, it's better to focus on individual species or multiple species. And I think, it's a real challenge is that, and I think that's probably why a lot of the work thus far within conservation has focused on those direct behaviors, so illegal wildlife trade, and they're looking at the supply chains of illegal wildlife trade, and so they're not just focused on necessarily those individuals killing the wildlife, but also those that are exporting it and shifting it, and those that are consuming it. But I think that's why it's focused more on those whether it's pangolin or people get upset if a developing company destroys koala habitat because there's that symbolism, and so it might using the term biodiversity is not great for external consumption, but I think it's good for internally within conservation science, and I think that's why you would see DELP would promote nature behaviors rather than biodiversity behaviors, right? What are your thoughts, Liam?
I grapple with this endlessly. I guess being a brutal behaviorist, I'm happy to use whatever means I can to get the behavior of interest. But I do think we get a bit stuck on the word, and so much of our preambles are about the biodiversity. IPBES or whoever it is say we're in crisis, whereas actually maybe if we start already talking about something that people can know and connect to more readily, we might be better positioned. I agree, internal consumption is probably the right way to frame it.
I wonder if the idea of that there's just too much to think about and we kind of shut down psychologically if we're thinking about the 1 million species that are going to extinct, what does that mean to an individual? I can't even fathom that. So that's a potential point as well.
There's probably a balance between, I guess, inclusiveness and broadness on the one hand versus specificity as well. People might find it easy to connect with some broader concepts versus finding much more practical implications from a more narrow one. So I'm just acknowledging it's after 1. I'm able to stay on a little bit longer. Maybe Matthew is too, but thank you everyone for attending and your questions. We'll circulate the slides and sorry, go ahead, Matt.
So thank you very much, and sorry that I had to rush through that last bit of it. So thanks.
It was very, very much appreciated, and hopefully just the start of many conversations from the sound of it. So well done, Matt, and thank you. If I was Philip Adams, I'd give you the koala stamp of honour that he likes to give on the ABC, but you'll just have to imagine an equivalent We need a MSDI seminar gift. I'll pour some wine into my laptop for you, something like that. There we go. All right.
Next time
So,
on Friday.
all right. This is my
Yeah.
son's foot. He wants to share it. All right. Bye-bye, everyone.